Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Lech Lecha, normally associated with the birth of the Jewish people. Reading it afresh this year, we discover that when the youngest son Isaac is chosen, it is at the expense of the older son Ishmael's banishment. We explore how Ishmael's role as the outcast in some way endears him to his father and later Rabbinic and Muslim commentaries. By being rejected, Ishmael may actually provide an alter ego and alter narrative to the Jewish people. So with apologies to Herman Melville, join us for Call Me Ishmael. So yeah, we're going back to Moby Dick. It feels like we're back in high school. But the reason I reference, not only is it a great title, Call Me Ishmael, and for those of you who have forgotten your high school class in literature, it is the first three words of Moby Dick. And Ishmael is the narrator of the whole story, and he kind of disappears. He's characterized as someone with little or no money in his purse, nothing to do. He says, if I stay here any longer, I'm going to start hitting people. So that's when I take to the sea. So he's kind of a wanderer, and maybe that's why Melville called him Ishmael. But more important to us, he kind of disappears in the narrative until the end when he's the only survivor. So normally, as I said in the intro, when we read Lech Lecha, we are focused on the birth of the Jewish people, on the amazing narrative of Avram and Sarai leaving their homeland and going on this amazing journey and pilgrimage. But along the way, we get this breath of Ishmael, this other character who, like Ishmael in Moby Dick, appears and then it's seemingly kind of disappears. So I think I'd like to introduce this whole episode because we are talking about Isaac and Ishmael, the two sons of Abraham, with a quote from Robert Alter, the great commentary, modern commentary as literature on the Bible. And he says the entire book of Genesis is about the reversal of the iron law of primogeniture, about the election through some devious twist of destiny of a younger son to carry on the line. So if last week we talked about the flip side of choosing a Noah, choosing an Abraham was regretting another choice, today we're going to talk about if the narrative of all of Genesis is choosing not the firstborn son, the secondborn son, then the flip side of that is the rejection of the firstborn son, or to put it more in a more ironic way, if primogeniture is a sense of entitlement of the firstborn, the Bible systemically rejects the firstborn. So it's the rejection of the entitled, if you will. And that's kind of an interesting way to look at the dynamics of not only Ishmael and Isaac, but Esau and Yaakov. What do you think, Rabbi?
I mean, that is the story. We're introduced. I mean, actually, last week we were given a little glimpse of that because the story of Noah getting drunk after the flood, there was Shem, Ham, and Yefet, and the one who's really chosen is Shem, who turns out to be the youngest son. So we get that a little bit there. But here, for the first time, we get the idea that Abraham has two sons. Ishmael should have been the chosen son. He was born, Sarah suggested that he bear a child with Hagar, with the maidservant. And he was born, and he should have been the one. And there shouldn't have been any story. But Sarah gets jealous, and then God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah. So the story is the fact that the older one is put aside for the younger one. And the famous introduction to the story of the binding of Isaac tells us that God says to Abraham, take your son, your favorite son, the son that you like more than anybody else. And Rashi says, why does he have to say so many things? Just say your son, take your son. No, he says, take your son. He says, I have two sons. Take your son you love. He says, I have two sons that I love. Take the son that you only one. Well, I have two sons, the only ones to their one mother. And so therefore, Abraham wasn't so sure which son it was. God had to tell him which son it was.
Man, you hit the nail on the head right there. No question about it. I think, to me, what's intriguing is when you systemically reject the firstborn and you pick the what would you normally call it, the runt of the litter, then the firstborn becomes the rejected. And that's kind of what's fascinating here. And it's fascinating, as you say, when in that episode where God says, pick your son, Abraham keeps going back to his quote-unquote rejected son, who is the firstborn. So here we go. We are in Genesis 16, and Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. And she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, look, God has kept me from bearing. Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a child through her. And Abraham heeded Sarai's request. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took her maid Hagar the Egyptian, after Abraham had dwelt in the land of Canaan 10 years, and gave her to her husband Abraham as a concubine. I just want to note that the Hebrew here is v'titen ota la'Avram, isha lo la'isha. So even though the translation is a concubine, I think, Rabbi, you'll agree with me, isha lo la'isha is as a wife, in a sense. So then it goes on and he says, and he cohabited with Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was lowered in her esteem. So here, if you give me a little literary license, either Hagar looked down upon Sarai because actually she had delivered and Sarai was barren, or Sarai is somehow projecting onto what Hagar must be thinking. Because then it says in verse 5, and Sarai said to Abram, the wrong done to me is your fault. She blames it on Abram. I myself put my maid in your bosom. Now that she sees that she is pregnant and I am lowered in her esteem, God decide between you and me. Abram said to Sarai, your maid is in your hands. Deal with her as you think right. Then Sarai treated her harshly, and she ran away from her. So there is a lot of focus on when Ishmael is actually born, that he misbehaves and he is thrown out of the house. But tellingly, even here, before he is born, Sarai sees a reflection in Hagar's attitude and already acts in such a manner that Hagar ran away. That's pretty profound, don't you think?
It is pretty profound. Think about what it means to run away. Here's a maidservant. She has nothing. She comes from Egypt. She's living in the home, let's say, of a successful man, in Canaan. If she runs away, she's nothing. Can you imagine, people like an au pair who comes from a foreign country running away from the family that she's working for? They're helpless. So it's a big deal that she runs away. It must have been pretty horrible.
So run away is one way to look at it. But if the circumstances were such as though she had no choice, in a sense, she was exiled. She was pushed out. And remember, as a Jew reading the Bible, I have a certain sensitivity to people who are exiled. So that becomes a fascinating double entendre here. And then it goes on. And remember, Ishmael is not born yet. A messenger of God found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, and the spring on the road to Shur, and said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? And he says, I'm running from my mistress. And he says, go back to your mistress, submit to her harsh treatment. And then the messenger of God says in verse 10, I will greatly increase your offspring, and they shall be too many to count. The messenger of God said to her further, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael. So it's almost a parallel story of a later story that we will read where Sarah actually rejects and throws out Hagar. She also comes to a spring of water, and she also is given a blessing. So this is almost like practice, like when children watch the scary movie over and over again so that they can wrap their arms around it. But already you get a sense of there is this respect and this sensitivity and this simpatico with Ishmael. The rabbi said that there were only a few people who were named before they were born, and Ishmael is one. So here, you shall call him Ishmael he's in a select few of people. You really, as much as we know the later story just forgets about Ishmael, at this point, you could almost say to me, I don't know where this story is going. I don't know who's going to be the hero.
Yeah, I mean, that's good. Let me just go back. You just said so many good things here. The fact that the story in this week's parasha and next week's parasha are basically, the same story. There's only one difference. In this week's parasha, Hagar gets banished. In next week's parasha, she doesn't like Ishmael. Ishmael is a bad influence on her son. So what happens to Hagar in both the cases is the same, but Sarah's view is different. In this week's parasha, you have this funny thing. She's competitive. You have to understand that, right? He's taking another wife. Not really, because clearly they had this idea of maidservants. But Sarah gets jealous. Next week, she's worried about the kid, and he's a bad influence. The older son, which we can understand, right? The teenage brother who gets the younger brother in trouble.
Absolutely. Normally when we discuss a parsha, we don't talk about what happens toward the end. But I think that's why my comment about Moby Dick and Melville is so important. That Ishmael is a figure who gets forgotten. But if you know all the stories coming in the future, we already can see stuff here that gives impact. And if we only discussed it later on, we would forget this crucible, this beginning of the whole account. So as I read on, it says, you shall call him Ishmael, and God has paid heed to your suffering. He shall be a wild ass of a person, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Here again, we see another motif where both Ishmael and Esav they have the kind of skill set that you might need going forward in Jewish tradition, going to the Shoftim, going forward in conquering the land. They are the people that have the skill set to conquer a land, to make their way. And in all of their cases, they have their supporters. In this particular case, we'll see that Abraham really is is consistent in his love and his dedication to Ishmael. In the case of Esau and Yaakov, again, we have Yaakov kind of likes Esau because he's out there hunting and stuff. So this is another kind of theme that I want us all to keep in mind. It's kind of like we're repeating this story over and over again to learn something from it.
Good. I mean, that's all good. The fact that the father seems to favor the son who loses. Now, you could explain that the father always favors the older son, but you could also explain it the way you just explained it. Rabbi Riskin always says it that way, that no, the father saw something in the older son that maybe the father lacked, or maybe he saw that would be important for the future, and therefore he actually preferred that. Now, the older son didn't win, but the father saw something that was special in the older son.
Absolutely. So here we are, and we are starting to see some patterns, and the patterns are fascinating. But the story moves on, and the story then goes to, and God said to Abraham in Genesis 17:15, and he changes, as for your wife Sarai, you shall not call her Sarai, but her name shall be Sarah. So changing Abraham's name and Sarai's name is almost like a rebirth. It's a change, Shanei Mazal. And I will bless her indeed, and I will give her a son by her. I will bless her that she shall give rise to nations, rulers of people. Abraham threw himself on his face and laughed as he said to himself, can a child be born to a man 100 years old, or can Sarah bear a child at 90? Verse 18, and Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live by your favor. In the Hebrew, it is, Vayoma Avraham el Elokim lu Yishmael yeh lefanecha. And the Ramban says its meaning is that he live and his seed shall always exist. So here, if you follow this interpretation, or even if you don't, you would think that when the son from his wife is announced, his first thought would not be about his previous son, his son through his handmaid. So whether you give the Ramban's interpretation or not, all of a sudden Abraham consistently is thinking about Ishmael. But if you follow the Ramban, he's saying he wants to make sure that Ishmael is not displaced. I think that's fascinating. And then it goes on and it continues in verse 20, and it says, as for Ishmael, God says, I have heeded you. I hereby bless him. I will make him fertile and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 chieftains, and I will make of him a great nation. But my covenant I will maintain with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. Done speaking with him, God was gone from Abraham. So the meeting was over. But I had never realized, Rabbi, that God had promised Ishmael 12 tribes. It's and in response to Abraham's request, I just had never resonated to me, and it really does give power to these parallel stories and Abraham's dual sense of love for both his children.
Yeah, I mean, it's really very powerful. And, it seems that Abraham, when the second time, when he sends Hagar away with Ishmael, that he sends him with a good knapsack full of stuff, which also is interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So we get to the point now that Ishmael is cast out, and at this point, we have commentaries like Rashi on 21:10 says, the matter distressed Abraham greatly, for it concerned a son of his. Vayara hadavar ma'od be'eni Avraham al odot beno. And the story goes way beyond our parsha, and we can only be like a prequel to what happens. But to do that prequel, what ultimately happens is that Hagar and Ishmael are cast out. Sarah again has an issue with them. In this case, she says that he is being mitzachek, he is fooling with Isaac. Some commentators say that he was sexually perverse. Some say that he was making fun of him, which is the obvious explanation. One modern day commentary says that he was Isaacing him. He was trying to say that I am the firstborn. But whatever the case was, the concern of Sarah is, I think, consistent, that she wants to make sure that the covenant is with her son Isaac. And the concern of Abraham is also consistent, that he is concerned about his other son. He loves him as well. And I think this is a powerful message. And, I'll go right to the end game, Rabbi. I've always been struck by the fact that on Rosh Hashanah, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the story of Hagar and Ishmael being cast out, being exiled. And on the second day, we read the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. And, there were all these modern day commentaries. I'd love to find out the original source of who decided what the Torah reading was for each day. But
goes back to the Talmud. It's about 2,000 years old.
But and I don't know if the Talmud gives a reason, but at the end of the day, if you get rid of all the commentaries, you're dedicating day one to the narrative of Ishmael. And day two is the narrative of Isaac. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. Or to put it slightly differently, you're dedicating day one to the test of Abraham with Hagar and Ishmael, and day two to the test of Abraham with his son Isaac. Fascinating.
That is fascinating. I mean, and the lesson of the banishment of Ishmael is the opposite lesson
Geoffrey,
as the Akedah. Right. So that's interesting. All interesting.
So it is fascinating. So what I want to do is there's fascinating where this story goes. In Genesis 25, and this is way beyond today's Parsha, it says that Sarah dies after the Akedah, and that Abraham then marries a woman named Keturah. And the tradition is that is Hagar. She was named Keturah, according to Rashi, because her deeds were a beautiful suite of incense. One of the Midrashim says she was Ma'alei mitzvot. She was full of mitzvot. And this takes on a whole new story in the later Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which gives, and I adjure you to all see the source notes on Sefirah, where I quote at length Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which was written in the much later in the 800s, that says that basically what happened was that whether during even Sarah's life, Abraham had asked, could he go visit his son Ishmael? I mean, it almost sounds like after a divorce where you ask your wife, can I go visit my child from my previous marriage? And in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer 30, that he gets permission from Sarah to go visit Ishmael, as long as he doesn't get off the camel. Meaning to say, I think, that, don't stay there, don't plant any seeds there, don't, make sure that you come back. And it's a long story, and he goes to the wilderness of Paran, and he meets his wife. And he says, where is Ishmael and Hagar? And she says they're out, picking dates. And he says, well, I'm a visitor. Could you feed me? And she goes, I got no food. And to make a long story short, he says, could you give a message to Ishmael and tell him that an old man came and that he should basically change his the entrance to his house, his threshold. And according to Pirkei de Rav Natan, Ishmael comes back and goes, what happened? And he says, this old man came and he asked about you, and he told me to exchange the threshold of my house. And he understood that, Ishmael understood that, to change his wife. So he changes his wife, and again, Abraham comes back a while later, and this time the story repeats itself, and this time he says to the wife, do you have anything to feed me? And she feeds him. As it happens, she feeds him, and he tells her to tell Ishmael about this. And Ishmael is told that his threshold is good. And that's the end of the story in Pirkei de Rav Natan. The amazing thing, Rabbi, that I discovered is that there is a Muslim version of this story. And the scholars all try, they're crunching their heads, they're twiddling their beards to find out which was the original story. And that interests me less. But in the Muslim version that is in the Sephirah notes, it almost goes pretty much the same. In that version, Hagar is no longer alive. He comes to visit his son. And again, he tells her to change wives. They change wives. But the difference is that in the Muslim version, his feet are washed by her. They come to a place called Makom, and then he helps him build a temple. And according to Muslim tradition, this is Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba in Mecca, and there is part of the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, that involves ceremonies that kind of reenact this whole episode. So it is absolutely fascinating on a number of levels. Number one, since we're in the Parsha of Lech Lecha, which is about pilgrimage, we can't but say that Hajj is the same as the Hebrew word Chag, which is the word for 3 times a year making the pilgrimage. So we're united at that level. But to me, it is just fascinating that we share this story. And I think there are multiple places where Islam has either preserved midrashim or introduced midrashim that were picked up by the rabbis. But it is absolutely fascinating how we share the story of Ishmael. Have you heard this before?
Yes, I have heard this before. The fact that there are shared traditions between the Jews and the Muslims is not surprising. You see, the Muslims believe that their line went through Ishmael. So therefore, Ishmael needs to be the winner, not Isaac. Now, the Torah has Isaac as the winner. But what the Muslim tradition stories have, they say even though Isaac was the winner, but he was only what appeared to be the winner. Everybody thought he was the winner. But actually, quietly, what Abraham was doing was he was going out to the desert and he was building Mecca, the temple in Mecca. So it's really a very interesting thing. How can you have Ishmael be the winner when the Torah says that he's not the winner? And the answer is that they have this underlying current which says that Abraham was more interested. Now, it's not made up, and this is the point, Geoffrey, that you made at the beginning, and that is it's not made up. Abraham likes Ishmael. He may even prefer Ishmael. So the bottom line is that from the Torah, obviously, even though Abraham prefers Ishmael, but Isaac is the one who's chosen. Isaac is the one who has the Akedah and all those kinds of things. But the idea that Abraham should prefer Ishmael, it's not as if the Muslims were making things up out of thin air. There really was something that was substantial about all of this.
So we don't have a lot of time, but let me move it to the third religion of Abraham. In Galatians, which is about Paul, otherwise known as Saul, a student of Rabbi Gamliel, Paul says, and he's talking to a bunch of Jews who want to keep this new version of Judaism for only the circumcised, and they want to keep keeping the laws. And he brings up Ishmael and Isaac. And he says that actually Isaac was the son of promise. Isaac was the promised child, and Ishmael was the natural child. We've heard that concept before. And he compares the Jews to the older son. By the way, when you hear the Pope or whatever saying, we love the Jewish people, they are our older brothers, they're implicitly saying that we're the older sons, the older brothers, we're not chosen. But that's another topic. But the fascinating thing is, and I don't want to comment on Paul or the New Testament and the whole concept of supersessionalism, which is where they took over the covenant. But it is fascinating to me that Paul does the obvious. He compares the Jews to the exiled Ishmael and he says that you got the Torah in Sinai, in Arabia. And we have midrashim that say we got the Torah in neutral land outside of the land of Israel. It is fascinating that we, as the Jews, could easily be compared to the rejected son who happens to be the entitled son who is rejected by our tradition. It's a fantastic irony. And the one thing that comes to my mind is he talks about the first wife. And at this point, we should all be confused because we don't know for Abraham who the first wife or the first mother is. And last week's Parsha, we had an amazing Haftorah, which happened to be my Bar Mitzvah Haftorah. And it talks about Rani Akara Lo Yalada, that the barren women shall rejoice because they are the blessed. And at the end of the day, Rabbi, what we do find throughout all of Genesis is the miracle of birth. And that ultimately is what we are celebrating here, whether it's the miracle of birth from someone barren or someone who can step in. We are all joined at the hip. And I just find that the story of Ishmael, who ultimately was loved by the rabbis. We have rabbis called Rabbi Ishmael, multiple rabbis called Rashmael. We have no rabbis called Rabbi Esau. So there is this love relationship and this kindred experience with Ishmael that I feel we cannot ignore and comes through loud and clear in this parsha and the narrative to follow.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey. This is an amazing topic, and really, there's so much food for thought. Enjoy Lech Lecha, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom to you all.